if you look at other raids on France and other raids anywhere, including all the fuss about the North African raids on the airfields by the SAS, in the end, I would argue that the Bruneval raid, Operation Biting, delivered a better result for Britain at lower costs than any other.
Hello. Late on the night of the 27th of February 1942, a company of paratroopers dropped into occupied France. Their target? A German radar station, the Würzburg, based at Brunewald. Commanded by Johnny Frost, who 2.5 years later made his name at Arnhem, the operation was a stunning success at a time when victories were few and far between. Joining me is legendary historian Max Hastings, as he talks us through the raid and the personalities involved, including Frost, Boy Browning and Louis Mountbatten. Plenty more great history to come, including the ancient Greeks, French collaborators, and plenty more. If you can, please leave me a gentle review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I would be hugely grateful. I know it'll take a moment of your time, but it really does make a difference. Until then, I'll hand you over to me, talking with Max Hastings and Operation Biting. Max, thanks very much for joining me. And we're going to be talking Operation Biting, your latest book. I should have counted the number of books you've written now, but we're doing well, aren't we? Or you're doing very well.
It's something like 31 or 32, but it's lovely to be with you and your audience again, because your audience, one always knows one is talking to people who share our common passion for history. This latest book, I think it's an absolutely wonderful story, but what I'm trying to do now in my book, having got to a certain stage, I've stopped writing the macro books, the First World War, the Second World War. I'm trying to focus on specific episodes and specific operations that I think are under-recognized and are wonderful stories. And in particular, all my books are people books in that they all try to focus on personalities rather than on the... But what really attracted me to Operation Biting, which was an airborne operation mounted in February 1942 against a German radar station just above Bruneval in Normandy. And it was the personalities who were involved. First of all, there was this wonderful man, R.V. Jones, in scientific intelligence, who had the idea, who, when he saw the aerial photographs and he saw they'd identified this new type of German radar that they hadn't seen the insides of, called a Würzburg. And he looked at it and he thought, he thought we could get in there. It's on the coast. It's only 90 miles from Britain. And maybe we could snatch the vital bits of this radar station. And then he put the chiefs of staff and Churchill, who were very enthusiastic, not much going on in Britain at that time. The British Army wasn't doing much. And Churchill was very keen for action all the time, saying we must keep the Germans guessing, we must keep the Germans busy. So combined operations, newly headed by Lord Louis Mountbatten, who a tremendous showman, although I personally also think rather a charlatan. And then, of course, airborne forces commanded by Boy Browning, and the personalities, the people who actually did the raid, all of them are absolutely fascinating people. So what I've tried to do in this book, not only is it the story of a raid, but I've tried to give a chapter each to all these extraordinary personalities, Mountbatten, Browning, Johnny Frost, the parachute regiment's first authentic heroes, and so on. And I found, although I thought I knew the story of Operation Biting pretty well, I kept coming across stuff that I had absolutely no idea about, and absolutely fascinating.
Well, it's described as almost forgotten in the inlay of your book, which is extraordinary because it was such a success.
It was, I mean, I personally would say, I'd stick my neck out and say it was the most successful Special Forces operation of the war, because the casualties were very light, and it achieved exactly what it set out to do by snatching this German radar. Whereas a couple of months later, they attacked the lock gates at Saint-Nazaire, which they always say huge success because they blew up the lock gates. But first of all, the people who study these things, naval history more closely than I do, were quite doubtful about how important those lock gates were to the Germans. And secondly, the casualties were horrific. About a third of the people who attacked Saint-Nazaire were killed or became prisoners or wounded. And then, of course, 2 or 3 months later, you had Mountbatten's unfinest hour with the Dieppe raid, which was an outright catastrophe. So if you look at other raids on France, and other raids anywhere, including all the fuss about the North African raids on the airfields by the SAS, in the end, I would argue that the Bruneval raid, Operation Biting, delivered a better result for Britain at lower costs than any other.
And even though, okay, it was a huge success, and Mountbatten was very keen to do it the moment he learnt of the idea from Jones, were the chiefs of staff too conservative, do you think? Do we need someone like Mountbatten, despite the fact that he is this sort of questionable figure?
I've always argued that Churchill was right and the chiefs of staff were wrong. That Churchill was always enthusiastic about what I call military theatre. That's to say, what we always have to remember is that between Dunkirk in 1940 and D-Day in 1944, everybody thinks about the Desert War and the Italian campaign and the war in the Far East. But more than half the entire British army spent the whole 4 years training in Britain, really doing almost damn all, because they couldn't invade Europe, they couldn't take on the main German army. And Churchill was very aware of this. And the chiefs of staff were always skeptical about this sort of piracy, these special operations and commandos and airborne forces and so on. But Churchill realized that the British people, it would be a little bit too cynical to say, had to be kept entertained, but they had to continue to believe that the war was really being carried on. And so one of the fascinating bits I've used in the book, some of the front pages from the newspapers the day after the Bruneval raid. The Bruneval raid was a tiny operation. It only involved 120 men landed in France, one company. But the publicity it got, all the headlines, Britain establishes, well, England, of course, in those days, you didn't talk about Britain, establishes first beachhead on the continent, and RAF, Royal Navy and airborne forces engaged. And this is big, big news. Well, was it really, really big, big news? No, but the British people needed to believe that the war was being carried on. So the raid achieved 2 things, or 3 things. One, it showed that surprise attacks by airborne troops were viable and could be carried on. Because remember, the British were just creating. The parachute regiment hadn't even officially been formed and wouldn't be formed until later that summer, although Bruneval's always hailed as its first battle honour. But also as a propaganda value, you always got, Churchill always understood, as the chiefs of staff did not, that the British people, it was a long, long war. And it was so depressing. They were always reading about what the Russians were doing and about Stalingrad hadn't quite happened, but about all the huge battles on the Eastern Front and all the stuff that was going on, and battles in the Pacific and Midway and the Coral Sea and all those stuff the Americans were doing. So all the time, a lot of people in the pubs in Britain were saying, what is going on? What are we doing? And Bruneval actually made a useful contribution to answering that question. So I think Churchill was dead right about the military theatre. But it's very interesting that Alan Brooke, who kept these copious and wonderful diaries throughout the war, Alan Brooke, of course, was one of those who had to give approval for the Bruneval raid. He doesn't even mention it in his diaries because he was preoccupied with the big campaigns, the big battlefields. The Germans never bothered with this sort of stuff, or hardly at all, because they thought wars are about the big battalions. The Americans never really believed in it. But I think between 1940 and 44, all those raids, some of them pretty damn stupid, they did fulfill a useful function in just trying to show the British people that the war was still being carried on.
So what was the objective? I mean, the British had radar. What are they trying to achieve in the raid?
Bomber offensive, the RAF's bomber offensive, was just gathering momentum. It hadn't done much, really, in 1940 and 41. But in 1942, it was really, you were starting to get, you had a month or two after Bruneval, you had the first so-called 1,000-bomber raids. And as these big streams of bombers cruised over the continent by night, it was absolutely vital to figure out how the Germans were defending themselves, how the Germans were using radar against them. And there was a big radar scanner called the Freya, which had been already well understood by the British what it was doing. But Würzburg, which worked out the altitude of incoming British planes and the short-range stuff, R.V. Jones, when he looked at this, although he prided himself and although he was a wonderful man, he was also a pretty vain one. And Reg Jones always flattered himself that he could usually figure out by sheer brain power what the Germans were doing with radar. But first of all, he thought it would be a big help to actually have the bits in our hands to be able to study what they're doing. And secondly, he thought it can be done. But his first thought, there was the radar station at Bruneval was perched on top of a cliff, 300-foot cliff. And his first thought, as he saw a little defile about half a mile from the radar station, and he traced it with his finger, and he said to his colleague, we could get in there. Well, actually, when they thought about it, the combined operations very quickly figured out that if you landed a force on the beach from the sea, that the Germans had had 2 years in which to fortify up the beach and all the beaches of France, and any British landing force would be dead before it could get up the cliff. But if you did it the other way around, if you landed troops from the air on top of the cliff and they hit the radar station, then you had landing craft come in from the sea and take them out with their booty. So that plan was the one they went along with. And also they wanted to test Britain's newly formed airborne division. There was General Boy Browning, as he was known, this impeccable Grenadier Guardsman who'd been put in charge of the embryo forces, married to the novelist Daphne du Maurier. And Boy Browning was absolutely thrilled with the idea of paratroopers being used almost for the first time. They'd had one abortive raid in Italy, but this was going to be the first outing. Now, somebody on his staff pointed out that even the Germans who pioneered the use of paratroops in 1940 had never tried a night operation. But the British decided they could do this, and Browning was dead keen. He was almost as much of a showman as was Mountbatten. I got fascinated by him too, because lots of people mention in the books that he was married to Daphne du Maurier, but they don't mention what an incredibly complicated figure he was. That Daphne du Maurier first met him in 1931, married him in 1932, and he was about as buttoned up a guardsman as you could possibly find. Daphne du Maurier, who was, to put it politely, a romantic figure, who she had trouble with him when she first met him, because she immediately wanted to go to bed with him. And he turned to her and said, nice girls didn't do things like that. And this was all frightfully low and vulgar, and you don't do this till you're married. And amazingly, there was a struggle. She didn't want to get married at all. But in the end, she realized if she wanted to go to bed with Boy Browning, the only way it was going to happen was if she married him. So rather reluctantly, she did. And when her father, who was a very famous theatrical actor manager called Sir Gerald du Maurier, was asked what he thought of this wedding, he said he was enormously relieved. He said, I thought by now she'd have had a baby by a Cornish fisherman. Anyway, the whole story of their relationship and how she hated being a soldier's wife. And even when you got up to World War II and her husband had become a general, she loved him, and she'd had 3 children with him, but she was still very unhappy with being the wife of a general. And you had this extraordinary situation that there was Browning getting the Bruneval raid underway, even as he faced a crisis in his marriage, that all Daphne du Maurier wanted to do was to go off to Cornwall, which she loved, and write more books. The last thing she wanted to think about was the war or the airborne division or any of that stuff. And she started having a relationship with the husband of the owner of the big house in which they were then billeted. And the whole story to me as a human story becomes far more fascinating when you think that even as Browning was training the company that was to drop into Bruneval and so on, he was having one hell of a problem with his wife.
And he was suffering from his experience in the First World War, which I don't think Daphne du Maurier was expecting to have to deal with, was she?
She thought when she married Boy Browning that he was a big, strong hero who'd won a DSO in 1917 in France for being almost the only surviving officer of his company, holding off German attacks. But then she found he was suffering from what we now call post-traumatic stress. And she said, she wrote to her sister, she said, he's like a small boy, almost going back to school, when he goes back to duty, when he goes back to command the division and so on. And he was a mass of neuroses and complexes. And again, she thought she was marrying a strong man, and she was very keen on strong men. And Boy Browning turned out to be not to be strong at all. And actually, in the end, if you look at his history, later in life, he became an alcoholic and had to, after the war, he had to retire as the Queen's private secretary because he had a nervous breakdown. So, and of course, by then, he'd also been through the experience. He commanded the airborne forces at Arnhem with disastrous consequences. But one's always fascinated by complicated people. And you couldn't get much more complicated than Boy Browning. And so that's an element in the story that I'm absolutely fascinated by. And of course, Mountbatten was also in a different way. He was another one who, there he'd married the granddaughter, the only granddaughter, Edwina Ashley, the granddaughter of Sir Ernest Castles, who was a vastly rich Edwardian financier. And as a result of Mountbatten having married her, he became enormously rich. He bought this great stately home, Broadsland. He was living in huge style. And on the one hand, senior officers, they couldn't deny that as a naval officer, he was a very hard worker and he rose through the Navy by sheer effort. But they did also think that he was a cad and a bounder, which indeed he was. And that whole story, I mean, he appointed as his chief of intelligence at Combined Operations, became intelligence chief for Operation Biting, this preposterous figure, the Marquis of Casamori, who'd been a fellow member of his polo team before the war, who was a Cuban aristocrat. And what on earth Mountbatten thought he fitted him to make him a wing commander and have him as the intelligence chief for Operation Biting, I can't think. But there he was. And all these outsized personalities getting involved in this extraordinary story. And then, of course, there's this lovely man, Johnny Frost, who commanded the company of the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment. Well, it wasn't then, it was just known as the Airborne Brigade, as it was then. But Johnny Frost commanding them. And he wasn't a Montgomery or a Wellington. He was just a really enthusiastic, brave, sensible airborne officer who'd achieved immortality a couple of years later, commanding the battalion at the northern end of the bridge at Arnhem. But in 1942, he'd never been in action, and there he was training his company for this amazing operation. And the responsibility it thrust on Johnny Frost, who I think was the best sort of British professional soldier. And there he was in charge of this operation, which the Prime Minister was taking a keen interest in, and all these grandees blazing with medals and brass hats and so on. And there was Johnny Frost, a humble major who'd spent the last couple of years commanding something out in Iraq, and where there was nothing much going on. And he had the responsibility for this operation. And what a hell of a responsibility it was. During the training, almost everything that could go wrong did. The first thing they discovered, they kept having practices with the landing craft, which had only just been built. The first landing craft had been created. But these were commanded by sort of ex-wine merchants and ex-city types and so on, all dressed up in naval uniform. But they hadn't much clue how to manage boats. And on the exercises, they were having terrible problems because in the darkness, there they were waiting on the beach to be picked up, and where were the landing craft? They were nowhere to be seen. And Johnny Frost wrote rather ruefully, he said, I did think to myself, if this happens in France, and there we are, and we've attacked the radar station, we got the bits, and then the Navy don't turn up, we're going to have a problem. And he was very prescient, although we'll get to that bit in a minute. But anyway, he was a terrific guy, up for anything. And his company, he called them a wild crew, but they were mostly Scots. They came from very tough places. And to get an idea of how tough they were, again, remembering this was one of the first special forces operations that had been carried out, they were all given these commando daggers. When they eventually end up in France, one of these really tough Glaswegians who's been up for anything, there he is engaged with the Germans, and he insists on killing one of these Germans with his commando knife just to see if it worked. And that's how tough these guys were. And so you had them all from I think Johnny Frost and his officers were quite frightened of them, because when they went on the piss in Salisbury out from their camp or whenever, they were a menace to all and around. But they were dead keen to fight. And in 1942, you were jolly thrilled to have people who were jolly keen to fight.
The Germans who were defending the radar, there's a wonderful picture in the book, and they do look a little bit ragtag.
They were about as ragtag as you get. What one has to remember, most of them were Luftwaffe people who manned the radar station. There were some soldiers, but not that many. But these were not the Waffen-SS. These were not the cream of Hitler's forces. And they thought they were having a cushy time in France. And I've included in the book one of my favorite pictures of a couple of them in the local brothel with a rather embarrassed-looking Frenchwoman in the middle of the picture. But they thought, when all their mates were off on the Russian front fighting in that ghastly struggle, they thought they got a pretty cushy number with all that food and drink and girls in France. And suddenly, all these mad Scottish paratroopers turn up in the middle of the night in the snow, if you please, and they're suddenly asked to pick up their rifles and fight. Well, half these Luftwaffe people had hardly seen a rifle. And so the fact they didn't make a great showing against the elite of Britain's airborne forces is not too surprising. And it was sort of, I think, one of the biggest mistakes the British made as a result of Bruneval. They got incredibly lucky in meeting this ragtag German force. And somehow they got away with this extraordinary attack. But they came away, and Mountbatten and Browning came away with the idea the Germans were always going to behave like that. And they didn't. Bruneval was a one-off. The Germans had a really bad night that night in Normandy. And after that, the Germans gave every British attacking force a really seriously bad time.
Yes, so the German response, they took it very seriously, wrote an exhaustive report on the raid itself, didn't they? So it really did have an impact in subsequent defensive.
Oh, there was, well, the divisional commander, the German divisional commander was sacked after it happened. The Germans really realized that it had been a shambles. But where the British were lucky, they were lucky in lots of ways. Of the 120 men who were dropped, about 40 were dropped in the wrong place. They were dropped a couple of miles west of where they were supposed to be on the dropping zone by the radar station. Now, the British, in their incredible luck, the first bit of luck was that all the key people, including Frost and the radar mechanics and all these key people, all turned up in the right place at the right time. The guys who were dropped a couple of miles away were not the most important people. And secondly, the fact that they were dropped a couple of miles away confused the Germans terribly. They had reports of paratroopers landing all over that end of Normandy. So they wondered, what are the British up to? Are they going to have an attack down further west? Is this the beginning of an invasion? Is this the beginning of... And they were confused and they couldn't figure out how to respond. So actually, it did help the British. Secondly, the night before, there'd been a snowfall, and this was almost the only operational drop of the war, that nobody was injured in the drop. Now, normally in all mass parachute drops, people are dropped. I once took part in a night mass parachute drop in Cyprus. And one of the things I remember most clearly was that we were all wearing Mae West's inflatable jackets because we were dropping near the sea. And 1,000 men dropped. And when I got to the ground, I'm going back now, I'm going back about 50, 60 years, but be that as it may, that I remember seeing all these red lights on everybody's Mae Wests and injured in a peacetime exercise, that you had all these people injured. But there you were in Bruneval, and 120 men landed without a single man having a sprained ankle. And that was thanks to the snow. And the other thing the snow did was that when the Germans started to respond and trying to get vehicles out and trying to get men from 3 or 4 miles away, they had a hell of a job to try and get their vehicles moving and to try and get people moving. So the Germans were incredibly slow to respond. And I think the operational plan was pretty optimistic because in order to have a nice tidy drop, they landed them about a mile from the radar site. And it was over an hour after the first paratroopers dropped before they attacked the radar. And during that time, the Germans did almost nothing. Well, it was almost miraculous, the sort of second miracle that they were able to, I won't say hang around for that length of time, but spend that much time getting their act together before they attacked. But they did it, and the Germans were taken by surprise, and they were able to seize the radar station with hardly any resistance, and they killed 2 or 3 Luftwaffe people. But then they were able to set about dismantling the radar. And it was a moonlit night, which meant everybody could see a certain amount. And they were a crazy moment. Reg Jones, who was a brilliant man, the scientist, he'd equipped one of the engineer officers with a flashlight camera to take photographs of the whole radar site. Well, I think that was bonkers because, of course, as soon as he began to use his flashlight camera, the Germans, who were about a quarter mile away, obviously started shooting at it. And after a few minutes, Johnny Frost had to tell this guy, he better stop taking pictures because every time he got a hail of machine gun fire. But fortunately, the Germans didn't have much ammunition. And they were able to spend 10 or 15 minutes wrenching this radar set apart. And it was, again, sort of miraculous. There they are. And after 10 or 15 minutes, they say to Johnny Frost, because the Germans were firing more and more heavily at them, we think we've got all the key bits. And so they were able to start to withdraw. But then their big problem, the only brave Germans that night were a group defending the defile down the cliff, down towards the beach. And Frost had already sent one party to go and clear the defile and clear the way to the beach. But this was minus half its people because they were all still running like hell from a couple of miles away where they'd been dropped in the wrong place. And so with this small force that tried to take on the Germans in the defile, they couldn't make any headway. So Frostbine, that they'd stormed the radar station. They'd only had one man killed so far. They'd got all the key bits of the radar, but this group of Germans holding the exit route down the cliff through this little defile was still holding out and blazing away with a machine gun, and several of Frost's men were hit. And every time anybody moved, another burst of machine gun fire. But then you get another miracle. A very brave young officer called Ewan Charteris, who'd been dropped in the wrong place. He suddenly came panting up, having run 2 miles and fought a few Germans on the way. We only had 4 of his men with him because most of the rest had sort of got left behind. And he reports to Major Frost, and he said, Lieutenant Charteris here and so on and so on. And Frost, who was feeling quite alarmed by that point. Were they going to be able to get out? And he said to Charteris, well, you're supposed to be taking out the beach defense. You better go and do it. And Charteris was the sort of guy, I know if I'd met him, we wouldn't have gone on at all because he'd been sort of head of his house at school and he'd been in the first 11 and he'd been everything else. And everybody, including in C Company, all regard him as a pretty bumptious young man who was dead keen to be a hero. But Charteris sort of saluted and said, absolutely, sir, and slithered down the hillside to where the Germans were holding out this position and charged at it with 2 or 3 blokes with grenades and a Sten gun and overran the position. And at that moment, some of the other blokes who got lost managed to get through to the Germans from the other side. And suddenly they were able to overrun the German position and clear the way to the beach. And Charteris was jolly brave, and he well deserved the military cross he got for what he did, because he didn't hesitate for a minute. He just charged at this German position. And you always need a few heroes like that. And of course, he was killed a few months later in North Africa. And I'm afraid the truth is, these very brave heroes, you jolly well need them, but an awful lot of them get killed. But anyway, the way the beach was cleared. There they were, making their way down with the wounded. They'd only lost 1 man killed so far, but quite a few wounded. And they get to the beach and they think, well, all we need now is the Navy. the sea's empty. There's nobody. They see absolutely nothing, no landing craft, nothing. What is going on? And of course, they all think it's just like the exercises. The Navy have got lost. And actually, the Navy, I think, were pretty wet that night. That there they were offshore, and they claimed they couldn't see the signals, that the flares that were going up from the British position, and they thought it all looked a bit of a shambles, and they could hear all the shooting on shore. And they just sat there. And unbelievably, C Company were able to sit on that beach for over half an hour without the Germans effectively intervening. Frost left a rearguard to hold the position on the cliff, but it was a sort of miracle that they were able to sit it out. And then finally, the not very bright naval officer offshore thought, oh, well, perhaps I better go and have a look. And he takes in his landing craft, and that they'd made this elaborate plan for boarding in succession. Well, actually, they just all sort of rushed the landing craft, and they chucked all the bits of the radar station on board, and they put in the wounded, and then all the rest of them sort of charged aboard. But the saddest story was that a few men got left behind. They, I think, if one's frank about it, they were people who, during the various firefights in the darkness, had thought discretion was the better part of valor, and they'd gone hidden in the trees while some of the braver blokes were doing the shooting. And in any event, there were half a dozen of them who got left behind. And now, as they saw in the moonlight all their mates evacuating from the beach, one of them, poor chap, he took a look and he panicked. He tried to climb down the cliff, and of course, he fell 300 feet and was found dying the next morning by the Germans. And he was only the second fatality, but they got all the wounded out, and they got all the rest. And also, the sort of 18th miracle of the night, that these landing craft, although one got terribly seasick, they were all able to sail at 7 or 8 knots back to Britain in those craft with all the stuff without the Germans interfering. And it was another miracle. And they all arrived back to be greeted as heroes. And so they jolly well were.
The radar, I mean, looking at it, it seems like the Würzburg, it's quite an impressive piece of kit.
They were terribly impressed when Britain's scientists got to examine all the bits. And actually, the engineers had managed to strip all the key bits from the radar set. And they decided that technically, in design, it was in some ways behind the British equivalent, but it was far better engineered. It was all made by Telefunken, and I'm afraid German engineers were always way ahead of the British. So they were terribly impressed by the quality of the German engineering. But as far as doing the business, but what they were able to work out, and this was critical, Reg Jones and his experts were able to work out, the key thing about the Würzburg was that one Freya set and 2 Würzburgs were only able to focus on one British bomber at a time. That one of the 2 Würzburgs tracked the bomber, and the second one tracked the German fighter pursuing it and brought them together. And they came up with the answer, which was so-called streaming, to try and push the whole British bomber force through a narrow strip of sky as quickly as possible to simply swamp the German defences. And this was very effective for some months. And it really did for a few months in the sort of perpetual tennis match between the scientists of the 2 sides. It did give the British a significant advantage. So Operation Biting, it was worth it. And it did make a significant difference. Not for that long, because in the course of the war, the balance of advantage was always shifting to and fro. But it was worth it scientifically. And it showed what you could do by surprise through airborne forces. And in a way, you can say Operation Biting was a shambles, because almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But on the other hand, with a good deal of help from the Germans, almost everything that could go right did go right. But I just love all the people involved. I mean, it's a great human story.
Well, there's even an interpreter, I think. I forget his German name, because he's
He was called
originally
Nagel. He was called Nagel. He was a German who'd been given the British name Walker, and he went with them. And in fact, Johnny Frost hadn't wanted to take him. Johnny Frost always referred to the Germans as the Hun or the Boche. And when Mountbatten came up to visit them during the exercises before the operation, and he said, had Frost got any worries? And Frost said, well, yes, I have. I've been landed with this bloody Hun that why do I want to take a Hun on an operation like this? We've been told all this stuff about German spies. What if he's a German spy? And Mountbatten then summoned this bloke, who was very young, he was about 22 or 23, apparently hugely successful with girls, but that's another story. And he quizzed him, Mountbatten, in fluent German, because, of course, Mountbatten was a German. And after quizzing him, Mountbatten said very sensibly, he said, I think this chap is all right. And he said, he's jolly brave, and he's got more at stake than you, because if he gets captured, he's a dead man. So he said, I think you must take him. And they did take him, and he did jolly well. Although the first thing, when they grabbed a Luftwaffe prisoner, that Nagel, now Walker, grabbed this bloke and tore the Luftwaffe eagle off the breast of his tunic. And another soldier said, what you done that for? And he said, for my personal satisfaction. And actually, in the photographs of the prisoners, you can see that this bloke's Luftwaffe eagle has been torn off his tunic rather crudely. I mean, there was another funny story. There were so many funny stories. After this Luftwaffe guy was captured, he was so anxious to win favor with his captors and not be shot that he preferred his wristwatch. And soldiers always liked taking wristwatches. And the Sergeant Mackenzie, said, I'll be having that. I won't try and do Sergeant Mackenzie's Scottish accent. But then, about a month later, in the safety of a prison camp, this German complained to the British authorities. They said, those evil paratroopers stole my wristwatch. And the British were so keen to try and prove that they played by the rules that they insisted that Mackenzie handed over this wristwatch. And Mackenzie then kicked up hell because he said he'd had to spend 5 shillings having the wristwatch repaired, and nobody offered to refund it.
Wonderful, wonderful. When one looks at Mountbatten after the raid, then presumably he's sort of, his chest is out high. He's had this big success, and he must have detected the skepticism amongst his senior officers.
Well, there was a very funny moment which Johnny Frost describes about how Frost, absolutely exhausted, you might expect, got back to their base in Wiltshire and was just about to get into the bar when somebody hammers on the door and said, you're wanted in London. The Prime Minister wants to hear all the detail. And so he's rushed up London in a staff car and shown down to the underground cabinet war rooms, which you can visit today, should you wish, where the Prime Minister and the whole war cabinet and the chiefs of staff are gathered for this tiny operation. Why? Well, it's perfectly easy in my mind to see. For weeks, the British have been enduring endless diet of defeats, especially in the Far East. Ever since the Bruneval had been launched, the Japanese had attacked in Java, the cruiser Exeter had been sunk. Churchill wanted to cheer up his own warlords. So there they were all gathered to hear details, all the great figures of Britain's war, Alan Brooke and the first Sea Lord and the head of the Air Force and half the war cabinet. And the Prime Minister says to Frost, well done, now tell us all about it. Well, Mountbatten wasn't having any of that. He elbowed Frost aside and he started telling the story of the raid. And when he was talking about the very good intelligence, Prime Minister interrupted and said, and who was responsible for the intelligence brief? And Mountbatten gave him a beatific grin and said, Wing Commander Casamore, who was standing beside me, who of course was Mountbatten's polo playing chum. Well, of course, it was all nonsense, and it was typical Mountbatten showmanship. But where I think Churchill was right, on one level, Mountbatten was a preposterous figure. He was a peacock. He was a frightful show-off. But on the other hand, at that stage in the war, you needed a bit of glamour. And the glamour provided by Mountbatten and by paratroops and by people like Boy Browning was worth a lot.
Well, it's a fantastic story, Max. It really is. And it's the characters, I suppose. You're absolutely right. It really does grab you throughout the book.
But it's a cliffhanger because I find here I know this story inside out, and yet I'm still, as I'm writing it, sort of wondering how it's all going to turn out.
But I mean, there are wonderful. I mean, I remember I read Operation Pedestal a couple of years ago when that came out, and they're just these wonderful characters in these operations that I suppose war creates that kind of approach. I don't know.
Well, we're all asking ourselves all the time, whether one's writing about it or reading about it, could we have done the same? And probably the answer is that you do. Each generation produces its own. I mean, I couldn't have done it, but I think there were lots of people I was so amused by this particular guy, Ewan Charteris, 20 years old. He found that as they were flying to Bruneval, the paratrooper sitting next to him, they discovered they both got the same 21st birthday a week later. And there was this guy. I know I would have hated him if I'd met him because he was everything I wasn't, sort of, captain of games and all the rest of it and so on. But these people, they did then, and I'm sure now, amazing things. And yeah, it's a great feel-good story.
What are you working on next, Max?
I'm doing another book about one very small aspect of D-Day, which won't appear for a year or two. But again, what's so wonderful, even though I'm getting quite old now, that I find when I'm researching these books, all the time, I'm learning new things. I mean, because I've been working on the Second World War for so long, I like to think I know a lot, but I'm always finding out these amazing new things, and especially new things about human behavior. And I'm always thinking when I'm writing books, sometimes the only advice I ever venture to offer to young writers, I say, sure, write what you want to write, but also think, what might other people want to read? And what I'm always trying to do every minute when I'm sitting looking at the screen, as I was this morning, working on this new book, and I'm thinking, now what can I tell people about this aspect of D-Day that they don't know already? And it's amazing how much there is.
Well, that's a very important piece of advice there. Thank you, Max. This has been fantastic.
Very, very nice to talk to you, and thank you for having me on the show.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great history to come, but in the meantime, thank you and good night.